least scarred, I should say. But, I lived in Mexico for my first 8 years. My parents were kind of forced out of the country during the McCarthy era, and so I lived in Mexico, and I grew up there till I was 8, and I was perfectly fine. I thought I was Mexican. Nobody said anything different till I came back to the United States, and they said I wasn't Mexican. And I said, I don't know, nobody told me that before, So in the U.S., especially in the mid-'60s, this was a big thing. So I found that I wasn't, black enough, Hispanic enough, Native American enough, I wasn't white enough, I wasn't anything enough, So it was pretty rough going. And because of my parents' background, and my mom brought us back in 1964. I wound up in the Lower East Side of New York, which was a pretty big culture shock. And then I wound up in North Carolina, rural North Carolina, which was a bigger culture shock. I was seeing the Klan, out there full force, and then, we went from there, when they discovered that my mom was actually white, which was illegal to be white and black under the same roof, we were forced to go to Detroit, and we were in inner city Detroit. And I have to say, it had an incredible soundtrack. That was a great time for listening to music in Detroit. But, the undercurrent of being there, that's when I was barely starting to learn English, and there was the Detroit Tactical Police and all this stuff, that kind of the pre-SWAT stuff, and all of the amount of violence and tension was, you could cut it with a knife. It was a very dangerous place, and Mom got us out of there eventually, she was, even in that neighborhood, she was like she was like a major support for all these kids, and we'd all go to Belle Isle together, and she was like everybody's mom, and so she just did amazing things like that. She tried to get into graduate school a bunch of places, and the FBI literally blocked it. At the University of New Mexico, they told the FBI to take a hike, and so she went and got her PhD there, and the rest is history, But just to give you some idea, I'm moving along and not even this. Okay, next slide. Okay, kid's eye view. That's what I was talking about. The next slide, to give you an idea, these are FBI documents, okay? One of these is an announcement of my birth. So I was born into the FBI files. I'm a red diaper baby. That's one of the things that's been coined. The other document here is the FBI spying on my parents while they were in a hotel. I'm thinking that they were actually watching my conception. I don't know. They were pretty crazy, but there was always this kind of stuff in the background. And, when I went to China, there was a car parked outside for a year, it's just kind of crazy. But so I'm going to speak a little bit more later in the closing. This was sort of like my first half, sort of an intro. There's people here that I've invited to talk because I think that they all have some unique perspective on what my mom has been able to do for them and for their career and their perspective on life. To say their career sounds so shallow. That's just not what was going on. I think we're talking about kind of major life, motion, right? So, yes, that's right. Actually, so Professor Michael White, Dr. Michael White, is he's a great personality in New Orleans. He's a very prominent musician and academic, and he's going to play for us. Okay.
Good morning. Dr. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall was a great friend of mine. I had the pleasure and honor of meeting her when she was doing a reading and signing for her book, Africans in Colonial Louisiana, a few years ago. There was a long line of people waiting to see her, and I was at the end of the line. And when I got up front, we talked for a while, and I don't know what happened between then and the next few months, but we became quick friends. We started having lunch together, talking, and she became a mentor of mine. And like many of you, she has influenced my work greatly, my writings, my publications, my music. We spent a lot of time together talking about everything from her research methods to what Haywood was doing at a particular time. I just wanted to play a little tribute to her, musical tribute, In the Sweet By and By.
That was amazing. You know, my mother had a big impact with the musicians here in New Orleans, and that's a big deal. You know, they referred to her book as the Purple Book. I think that, you know, there was so many connections that were fostered and made between their work and the history. I mean, just obviously it's so important to know where you came from, and it's just and Michael White's one of those great people who has been involved in that circle. I have on our list Ibrahima Seck. Ibrahima, is he here? There he is. Okay. All right.
Merci. Thank you. Good morning, beautiful people. 1993, 30 years ago, I was 33 years old and a pretty young teacher in high school in Senegal. And a lady who is a specialist of African literature came to Senegal with our late historian and colleague Mustafa Khan to open the West African Research Center. She is from Donaldsonville, and I think it was her uncle who invented the sugarcane planting machine. I would like to name and recognize Eileen Julian. Yeah. Always be into business. If you have one seed, just put it in the ground. You never know what the outcome will be. I would like to thank you very much for that seed you planted in Senegal. And Gwendolyn Midlo Hall were invited to be the keynote speaker at the opening of the West African Research Center. I was in the crowd, and I really thank God for inspiring me to get over there. Like I said, I was a high school teacher, and also I was the editor of the Journal of the Professors of History and Geography in Senegal. And there was Gwen speaking about Africans in colonial Louisiana. She had her papers in her hand, and that's when, for the first time ever, because here maybe you are not well educated about slavery. We have the same problem over there too. Maybe we know well what happened in Africa, but not much about the diaspora. We may know James Brown, Michael Jackson, Muhammad Ali, and people like that, but not much about really the lives of Africans in the Western Hemisphere. We just thought they were gone, they lost everything. And this is Gwen talking about Africans with a lot of agency. In Louisiana, saving the country from starvation, growing rice, handling the cattle, building levees, building wealth for the enslavers, and at the same time, defining the culture. And that's a true story of glory. And I think Gwen inspired many people in this world, not only in America, but everywhere, France, all of that. After her speech, I went to meet her, and I literally took the papers from her hands. I said, Madame, I want to publish this. And I asked her, where are you from? She told me I'm from Louisiana, New Orleans, and I told her I will find you one day. And I found her. Immediately after that, I went back to the University of Dakar to get a doctorate degree. Went back, went to the American Center to learn English. And she did help me all the time I was working on my dissertation. I did it in Dakar, but anytime I had a grant to travel to the United States for research, I always met her. And I graduated in 1999. The next year, I was in a delegation of the mayor of the Gorée Island. He was invited at the opening of the African American Museum in St. Martinville, Louisiana, on Bayou Teche. After our visit, she knew we were here, and she told us when on our way back home, please stop over here in New Orleans, and I will host you in my house, the house on Dante Street. 12 people. So, you know, and in the meantime, she also called John Cummins, who had just bought this plantation, and I think she inspired him too. to turn it into a real museum of slavery. And when we came, when we made it to New Orleans, John Cummins came to meet us, and the next day he brought us over here. It was just wilderness. And he told all the members of the delegation, you are not going to stay in that house. It's too tight. Come on and stay in my hotel, downtown New Orleans on Camp and Gravier. And he talked to me. Gwen, Mom, did tell him, put on your team this guy from Senegal. And John Cummings hired me right away to be the director of research. That's 22 years now. So I owe to Gwendolyn Midlo Hall a lot. If I'm here talking to you today, that's thanks to Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. And she was a mentor for many people. When I look around, I see Jessica Johnson. I think for inspiration, she won many awards, a significant award after publishing that book, Wicked Flesh, that links Senegal and Louisiana. Would you stand up a little bit, please? Yeah. And we have a good friend who are doing a good job too about Louisiana history and culture. One of them will speak later. That's Ned Sublette. And near him we have Joel Dinostan, who was the former director of the Center of Gold South. That's it, at Tulane University. The City of a Million Dreams, that's Jason Berry. Everybody knows, I think? We have a lady here who did a good job on Mary Lovo, that's Ina Fandrich, Mambo Ina Fandrich. I may forget some. I met you, thanks to Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, you remember, on Dante and Plum, 1300 Dante. I have many good friends here. I'm just not to, to stay here longer. We have Professor Al Kennedy, who was a good friend of the Black community in New Orleans. Al Kennedy, yeah, and Madam. Let me see. I think I have at least one. So thank you, everybody who came here today. And we have also a great mission, Sunfire Barnes. He took on himself the duty to come over here to play something too when we get to the ground. So I'm here thanks to Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. And I hope I will be allowed to stay here until I fell on the ground. That's my wish. And I will talk to you later about the making of this museum, and especially a memorial dedicated to Gwendolyn Midlo Hall to recognize her work, but also that's the Gwendolyn Midlo Hall Allées right here, Les Allées Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. That's a virtual cemetery. And one thing maybe you don't know is that if you have a list of people, an inventory, or people who were taken to court together, you can find them here. Yeah, you can find them here if they were documented in what we call the Louisiana Slave Database from 1719 to 1820. I will tell you more about that later. So once again, thank you so much for coming. Merci.
Okay. Well, so you can see it's just inspirational to many people. I'd like to call Professor Eileen Julian. She's like a sister to me, and we've spent some time talking, and I think we're very connected.
I was looking for Douglas Timbers, and I forget to recognize him, please.
Yeah. I think you know.
Douglas Timbers.
Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, so there was just an addendum. Doug Chambers, he wanted to mention, and Joyce Jackson. Obviously there's a lot of people that we could never stop if we started this. But anyway, I would certainly like to have Eileen Julian tell us. She's a storyteller. She's from the University of Indiana, and well.
It really is a pleasure, actually. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here to speak about Gwen. Gwen came into my life in 1993, that year we've already just talked about. I had heard about her book, Africans in Colonial Louisiana. It was all a buzz in New Orleans. You got to read this book, you got to get this book. And so finally, in 1993, I had just moved from Boston University to Indiana University. And my thesis advisor from some time ago said, we really need someone to go over and start up this center, this West African Research Center. Can you apply for a Fulbright to go? I said, I just got here. They're going to be pissed. I mean, I just came and I'm going to go off next year and go, I can't. He said, you can do that. You can do it. So I tried, and they let me go. They weren't happy about it, but they let me go. So in 1993 then, I was going to become the director of this center, which was meant to put together researchers from Africa, West Africa, and researchers from the U.S. So what happens then is that, so I get Gwen's book. This is the summer now, before I actually move. I get her book, and I'm home for a month or so. I bought the book at the Maple bookstore, some of Maple Street, you probably know that shop. And so it's June, the weather's lovely. Every morning I take the book, I go down, I sit on the kind of sofa that's in the screened-in porch. I get my cup of coffee and I start reading this book. I love that book. I could not put it down. But I was also looking at the end of the book, what's coming up, and I was feeling like it's going to end soon. I should stop reading, because I didn't want it to end, but I couldn't stop reading it. I loved it. I loved it for many reasons, partly because I felt that it explained New Orleans to me in a way that I had never thought about New Orleans. I had never understood New Orleans in Gwen's terms. It had folklore, it had poetry, it had proverbs. We saw the extent to which having a black slave, or a slave of any sort, an enslaved person, meant that you had a certain wealth. And so if the white guy down on the next plantation wanted to beat up your enslaved person, you weren't going to let that happen. It framed the question of race and the question of labor in ways that I simply had not perceived. It was all about language, and I teach literature. It was a wonderful book, and I devoured it, afraid, of course, to get to the end. So, okay, the end of the book comes. I pack up my bag. I move to Dakar. And then to start the center. When I got there, the center had nothing. I mean, I like to say, and it's true, it didn't have a pencil, it didn't have a pen. It was an empty space. And so one day, the public affairs officer of the embassy, of the American embassy, says, oh, well, we're about to invite the Rebirth brass band. I said, you're inviting the Rebirth brass band? He said, yes, we're going to do a West African tour, the Rebirth brass band. I said, well, if you're inviting these performers to come, you need to invite the historian who can tell you what the links are between Senegambia and Louisiana. And he looks at me, perplexed, and he says, that's a great idea. So call her up and see if she wants to come. Now, before that, I had a friend named Sandy. I had been with her at the Bunting Institute that from long ago at Radcliffe. And she said, you should call her, you should tell her how this book makes you feel. I said, well, okay. So I called her before I left, and I said, I'm coming back in November for African Studies Association meeting. Maybe we could meet up. I'll be on the East Coast. She said, oh, I'll be on leave, I won't be there. So we sort of pledged that we would get together in some future moment. So now I'm calling her from Dakar and I'm saying, Gwen, would you like to come over and be here during the Rebirth Brass Band, visit? And she said, I'd love to come. I mean, I was astonished. She said, yes, instantly. So we arranged it. She came. She gave a great talk. And at that talk, of course, was Ibrahima Seck sitting there quietly, observing, listening. And of course, his English wasn't really good English at that point. He said, I'm going to learn English to be able to study with her. And that all worked out. When he arrived, we picked him up. My then husband, who's deceased at this point, who's Senegalese, who was the director of the School of Art, we picked him up, we took him, and then it turned out it was in July, and the Julian family was having our big biannual reunion out in Modeste. And so Ibrahima came with us to that. And that was how he got sort of started here, which was wonderful. At the same time, apart from that, Gwen had such a profound influence on me in my teaching. I mean, I taught this course called Black Paris, which is all about all the American refugees from United States racism and apartheid who went to Paris. And I always then began including Africans in colonial Louisiana, which the students really enjoyed. She also is in the book Creole New Orleans, I believe it's called, with Tregle and I can't remember, there's one other, Hirsch, Tregle, and Hall. And so I was including that. So my students got a very large dose of Louisiana history, of American history, through Gwendolyn's eyes. She came to Bloomington, Indiana, and stayed with me during Katrina. She gave a talk. She was extraordinary in every way. And she became something of a surrogate sister, big sister, mother figure for me. She had an intuition about people, a savvy about lives, and I was just completely in love with her for years, and was very fortunate to have seen her shortly before she died. So I don't know what else to say about Gwen except that she marked my life in a way that is really fundamentally very profound, and I miss her dearly already. So I think that's it.
Okay. So the next person that I have on our list is somebody who's come to visit my mother like a lot. Kathe Hambrick. If you can come up, it'd be great.
Thank you, Haywood, for giving me an opportunity to say a few words about my friendship with your mother. She was a sister friend to me. I am an only girl in my family of 4 brothers, and Gwen was also to me like a big sister. And I think that our relationship over the years, from when I met her first, I came back to Louisiana from Southern California in 1991 after telling my parents when I graduated from high school in 1975 that I'd never live in the rural South again. I absolutely hated Ascension Parish. As much as I loved my birth home of New Orleans and my family in St. Tammany Parish and my family up and down this river, I hated Louisiana. I hated everything about the plantations. I hated all of the memories of the pain and suffering of our ancestors who worked so hard to reluctantly contribute to the economy and culture, not only to the economy and culture of Louisiana, but their contribution to the economy and culture of this world by providing free labor on these sugarcane plantations. I hated this place. But I found myself back here in Louisiana in 1991 when my father passed away and my brothers and I inherited a funeral home. I left IBM after 12 years of being a systems analyst, and I realized after walking around the French quarters that all of the gift shops in the French quarters only had gift souvenir items that looked like Aunt Jemima and Little Black Sambo. We're talking 1991. We're talking the 20th century. So here I was back in Louisiana, hating it all over again, eating my words that I told my parents I'd never live back here again. Little did I know, after visiting 12 plantations between Destrehan and Natchez, Mississippi, and talking to each and every one of the plantation owners between Destrehan and Natchez, Mississippi, about my concerns and the memorabilia that they carried in their gift shops at that time. Also representative of what I saw in the gift shops in the French quarters, Aunt Jemima and Little Black Sambo. They kind of patted me on my back and sent me on my way. And then finally one night I woke up in the middle of the night and I said, you know, there needs to be a museum to tell the story and to honor the people who worked on the plantations, particularly one plantation, the Homer's House, which was the largest plantation here in the River Road region. As many as 2,000 enslaved people worked there over the course of the time that the Homer's House was in business. So I started to do research. I didn't even know what a museum was really. I always visited museums as a child with my family all around the country. I didn't even know the definition of a museum at that time. I started to do research because I actually could have minored in African American studies at Cal State Long Beach in California. Studied about Egyptology, Africans in the Congo, blacks in the law, black women in literature, black women in theater, black studies from almost every angle imaginable. But what I realized when I came back to Louisiana was that I knew so very little about the black history and the African people who worked on these very plantations in the community where I went to high school. I even, over the years, over that first year that I was doing research to start the museum, I called Ira Berlin. He answered the phone and actually talked to me. I called John Hope Franklin, and he talked to me. And I asked them, as scholars, why can't I find any information about slavery on sugarcane plantations in rural South Louisiana? And they couldn't really answer the question. They would turn me to books about the Caribbean and books about Brazil. And there, of course, there's all of the books about slavery in Maryland and Georgia and the Carolinas, and lots of information about the Gullah people and the rice culture. Lots of books about the transatlantic slave trade. And I was becoming so very frustrated. And then I met Louisiana's first African-American curator at the Louisiana State Museum. His name was Chuck Seiler. And Chuck said, you need to meet my friend Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. She just published a book called Africans in Colonial Louisiana. And he gave me her number. And when I called Gwen, she invited me to come to Hattiesburg. And Ibrahim was there that week, and I think I stayed about 3 days with you and Gwen in Hattiesburg. And I must have had a list of about 100 questions about every plantation that was on the Percy-Sachs map. Do you all know the Percy-Sachs map? That plantation map that is in most doctors' offices and lawyer offices around Louisiana. And it shows the Mississippi River from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Natchez. And it shows the arpents of land owned by plantation owners on both sides of the river in every parish, all the way through South Louisiana, both sugar and cotton plantations. And I asked Gwen, you know, where are these places? Why are they're on this map with these little strips of land? And I asked Ibrahima about Senegal and where he lived. And I told them that I had a list of names of people who were enslaved at the Homus plantation. And I shared that list. And I can remember Ibrahim saying, these are my people, because he saw names in that list of enslaved people from the Homus house where their names were West African names. Gwen was not just a scholar. She wasn't just an author. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was a grandmother. She was an aunt and friend to all of us in this room, no doubt, a friend to all of us. I can remember when I went to Michigan State University with her to a big conference on databases, worldwide databases on slavery. And there were people there from the Cameroon, from Brazil, from all over the world, and UNESCO, and they were all praising Dr. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, because here she was, I believe maybe a woman in her 60s at that time. I came from IBM, working for IBM as a systems analyst, 12 years, and here was Gwen, a novice who understood software and metadata. I don't even know if the metadata was a word back then, but working with Gwen and going to Mexico over all of these years, she understood what metadata was. And she wasn't even an engineer. She was a genius. She was a genius. I couldn't keep up with her. I couldn't keep up with her in the airport. I couldn't keep up with her in that mobile stroller. Ina and I mean, she was like, excuse the expression, gone with the wind. She would get on that motor scooter and cross the street and zoom up and down the terminal hallways. And I must tell you this story. I was on my way back with her to Guanajuato, and we were at the airport in Houston. And Gwen was in her wheelchair. And TSA was letting everybody through. Even let me through, no problems. And so I couldn't understand what was the holdup with Gwen. She's in a wheelchair. The lady told us, the security guard told me that they had to take her to the back to search her. And I was very upset. And I wanted to say, you can't take this old lady, and I had to catch myself because I never referred to Gwen as an old lady. But I had to catch myself. You mean to tell me you're gonna let all of these people, strangers that you don't know, pass us, take me instead of her, but do not take her dignity away from her by taking her in a back room and searching this 89-year-old woman who is in a wheelchair. And Gwen looked over, I mean, I was about to make a real big fuss, right? And Gwen looked over to me and she said, shh, I'm okay, Kathe. So I was quiet, and they rolled her off, and then they brought her back. And she was so calm, cool, and collected, and I was just fuming under the collar because they had done that to her. I can remember going through her files and helping her. Angelique Bergeron and I from the West Baton Rouge went to help her organize her files. And I came across this folder that said FBI. And I said, oh, Gwen, what is this? What is this? And she said, oh, I had to go through the Freedom of Information Act and get my FBI files. And then she started to tell me about her work with the Deacons of Defense. And she said, Kathe, you need to get your files too, because they probably have files on you too. I I knew then I was in good company. It's amazing. There's a word called serendipity. How could I meet this woman 2 years after I get an idea to start Louisiana's first African American museum? A Jewish woman who had a shared history, because Gwen explained to me that the sugarcane plantations were no more than concentration camps. She told me about her Uncle Sam and gave me an autographed copy of his book. And that's Sam Samuelson. Sam Samuel? Hyman? Yes. She told me that her family is buried in the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery of Donaldsonville. So after the fire at Texcoco, which was where the River Road African American Museum was first located in 1994, we just happened to move to Donaldsonville because there was so much Black history there. One of the first stories I learned was about Eileen's uncle, Leonard Julian and Harold Julian, her two uncles, who invented the sugarcane planting machine. How in the world, other than it be God and serendipity, that would lead us to Donaldsonville, where we now own 6 buildings, a part of our African American Museum complex? If it were not for Dr. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, there would be no River Road African American Museum. There would be no museum here at the Whitney Plantation to pay homage and tribute to all of those enslaved people, men, women, children, and babies who were part of slave trafficking rings. Yes, I said it. This was slave trafficking that has contributed to the economy and culture of Louisiana and this world. I love you, Dr. Hall. I love her family. She was a global scholar, and she has friends, no doubt, all up and down this river road, children, teenagers, college students who are reading her book. Yes, we do call it the Purple Book. I want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing, and God knows how we ended up in Donaldsonville, right around the corner from the Jewish cemetery where her family is buried. Thank you, Haywood, for giving me this opportunity.
Wow. Okay, so the next person is Percy Pierre. He's an amazing person, great history, and a great story.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I did prepare some remarks, and since I prepared them, I will use them. I knew Gwen for 40 years, and I can't do justice to those 40 years in the short time we have, but I'd just like to briefly tell you about some of the things that we did and some of the things we had in common. I must first tell you that what we didn't have in common was profession. She was a historian, I'm an electrical engineer, but we got along very, very well, and I think we thought a lot. Gwen was a friend and an academic colleague. She was a great scholar. However, she was more than a great scholar. She was also committed to justice for Black people. I learned that early and often. To better understand our relationship, you need to know a little about me. Okay. Can you hear me? All right. A little about me and my quest for my ancestors, my genealogy, because that's how I met Gwen. Most of my ancestors from the last 200 years are from this area, from Welcome, Louisiana. Most of them 200 years. And I was born in a little community called Jamestown, which was part of Welcome. And my father was born in Freetown. Some of you may have heard of Freetown. It was established by freed slaves just after the Civil War, a few miles down the road from Welcome. And my grandfather, Adolphe Pierre, was born in 1877 in that same area. My great-grandfather, Adolphe Sr., was born a slave in 1835 on the Bergeron plantation. And my great-great-grandfather, Pierre, who gave us our surname, Pierre was his given name, became my surname. He was born on the Dugas plantation just south of Donaldsonville in 1810. And I have a copy of his baptismal record from Ascension Parish archives. And that baptismal record said that his mother's name was Pelagie, and she was a slave of the Dugas. That is where I was stuck until I met Gwen. It was in the early 1980s that I went to the historic New Orleans collection on Royal Street, I think it is. They told me about a woman who had compiled a database of public records of slaves in Louisiana. They said this database was not available. This is the early 1980s. I could not look at it. However, if I gave them names, they would look up those names. I said, I want you to look up Pelagie. Find the Pelagie in your records. It's got to be before 1810. So they found a record of a slave, of the sale of two slaves. A slave named Pelagie and her mother, Therese. And this sale was to a man by the name of Moreau in Ascension Parish. Now, sales records for slaves provided information about the origins of the slaves, particularly whether they were born in the States or in Africa. And it turns out that Therese was born in Africa. The record of that sale of Therese and her daughter Pelagie is still in Ascension Parish Courthouse. Here's a copy of it. And the original is there in the courthouse, and I visit it often. So I identified my first African ancestor through Gwen's database. That was thrilling. Now, that record, that sales record, said that Therese was of the Makwa tribe. I didn't know what that meant. I visited Gwen. Gwen, tell me, what does that mean? Makwa is an ancient tribe in East Africa that had been preyed on by the Arabs and others for slaves for 400-500 years. The French, got slaves from the area currently called Mozambique. So Therese was probably, captured as a slave by the coastal tribes in East Africa, sold to the French probably, and came here. So I've learned a lot about the Makwa and Therese, and she's very special to me, and that was because of Gwen. Now, the first time I met Gwen, I called her and said, Gwen, I'd like you to help me continue my search. And she said, well, why don't you come to my house about 6 o'clock tomorrow night or something like that. Now, most white women in New Orleans at that time didn't invite black men to their homes at that hour, but she met me, she was very gracious. She was living in the Carlton section of New Orleans, and that was the first time I met her. That was the early 1980s. And she helped me with my research. But we stayed in touch after that. In the year 2000, a lawyer contacted Gwen, who was doing an article for the ABA, the American Bar Association Journal, on reparations for American slavery. The American Bar Association is the biggest of those associations, and the author was looking to find someone who could make a legal case on behalf of themselves for reparation, and Gwen said, Percy Pierre can do that. I told the author that I knew all of my great-grandparents, all of whom were slaves. I know who owned them. I know what their value was at that time. So if you want to make a legal case, I've got the particulars. So I told the author that. The author wrote the article. It appeared in the November 2000 issue of the ABA Journal. So that was the article. However, I never filed the case because there's something called, what is it called? Statute of limitations. So I still have the case, but if they erase the statute of limitations, I can file and get some money. So that was Gwen. She was pressing on reparations. I next met Gwen at Michigan State University. I was a professor of electrical engineering there. And she shows up. And she was working in the Department of African Studies. So we got together, and we had lunch, and we talked. And she knew that I had previously been a vice president at Michigan State. I'd been there a long time, knew a lot of people. She asked me, would you help me out? She was trying to persuade people to do certain things. And I said, fine. So I attended several meetings with her chair, and tried to twist his arm. I supported Gwen for whatever she wanted to do, but Gwen was not shy about asking, and she was pressing. She was pressing. The chair was resisting. So, okay. So that was Michigan State. And then in 2012, Gwen told me that she was going to receive an award from one of the historical associations at their annual meeting in New Orleans. I don't know, some of you may know about that award she received in 2013 actually. So I congratulated her on receiving that award, and I told her that I would be in New Orleans at that time, and I told her that I know all of her friends in New Orleans will get together to congratulate her, but I wanted to do something special for her, to introduce her to the black community in New Orleans and introduce her to my friends. And I said we're going to hold it at the African American Museum in Treme, New Orleans. Treme is an African American community, and we're going to hold it at night. And I said I can understand how maybe some of your friends may not want to be in Treme at night, but you can get together with your friends. This will be for the African American community. Well, she was very excited about it. She continued to send me names of people to invite, and we invited maybe some of you here to that event, and it was a wonderful event, and it was one of the most integrated events in Treme I think they've ever had. So that was a great event. One of the things great about it was I got to meet Haywood, and Haywood gave some remarks, and he was moved, and I don't know whether he's always moved, but he moved me and made me believe that my effort to honor Gwen was appropriate. Not only Haywood was there, but Haywood's sister Rebecca was also there, and John Cummings, the founder of the Whitney Museum. And that was a great night. Really, really enjoyed that night. Now, the last time I communicated with Gwen was a few years ago when she was living in Mexico and could not travel. But Gwen had a great life. I researched her life quite a bit. She impacted the lives of many people, especially black people. But even more than that, she was a dear friend of mine, and I miss her.
So Percy's a little modest, so I have to say a couple of things. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he was the secretary of the Army for a while, I understand. Okay, well, so the next person on my list here is Steve Miles. He's a fellow physician and somebody I admire greatly.
All right, can you hear me? All right, that's a good thing. I'm relatively junior in this crowd because I only knew Gwendolyn for 20 years, and I'm very honored to be asked to speak here. I was working at the University of Minnesota with the members of the African American community with something called the Cultural Wellness Center in South Minneapolis. Now at that time, the African community in Minneapolis was very interested in the question of learning about their ancestry. Many people in the community were turning to genetic profiling to try and learn something about their approximate ancestry. But as everybody here knows, genetic profiling is highly matrilineal. It has some very coarse regional use, but it does not find personal, familial, or tribal identities. The kind of identities that are customarily of interest to people who are trying to understand, trying to learn their ancestry. And so the African American Wellness Center and I decided to hold a conference and secured a small grant for that. And we had a speaker who was very much into genetic identities. We had a speaker who was interested in African civilizations, and then I had heard of Dr. Hall's research and got her invited to this conference. Of course, she gave a wonderful talk, a show actually, on how she used ship manifests to identify the names of origin, the villages of origin, the tribes of origin of people who had been captured, enslaved, commodified, imported to the United States and then sold as labeled parts to the named owners of specific forced labor farms and industries. I use forced labor farms because after the famous Dred Scott decision, a woman won a case to keep her freedom in Minnesota, and that was the term that she used when she testified under oath in Minnesota in 1858. I just learned of this case 2 weeks ago, and I've already forgotten her name, but I have it at home. At any rate, Gwendolyn was charming and riveting, and our friendship and correspondence lasted 2 decades, and I even got to meet Haywood when I went down to the family compound, met the new dog at the time. But the miracle that I want to talk about happened on the last day of this one-day conference. The Wellness Center and I had agreed that what we would do is have paper presentations at the end, but what we did was we invited school children from the near south side of Minneapolis and north side to present papers on what ancestry meant to them, and their teachers helped them develop these papers. This was the first time that many of these children had come, or their parents had ever been on the university campus. And one by one, each child stepped up to the podium and read their paper aloud. And Gwendolyn was sitting right there, cheering on each student, clapping them, shaking their head when they got down from the podium. And then she stuck around for the reception and talked to the parents and kids alone. Now, that was a profound, generous, and unfortunately, not all too common act of teaching and affirmation and empowerment as she drew those children, who are the grandchildren of these children, into the next generation of scholars. It was a privilege to watch, and it's an honor to assure that that act will be remembered.
Okay. You can see this is an amazing impact all over the place. It's just great. The next person I want to introduce is Ned Sublette, who is someone I've known since the 80s, I think. And the way I knew him was because I was a fan of his radio show, Afro Pop Around the World, and it was the one thing that I would just, every week couldn't miss that. It got me through my medical school and residency and everything. And then, surprise, he was interviewing Mom, and so anyway, this is Ned Sublette.
Thank you, Haywood. I'm so happy I was able to get here for this. And it's been really, I gotta say, I feel I've known you for so many years, we've occasionally corresponded. Gwen would talk about you a lot, and of course the memoir and all the rest of it. But it's the first time we've ever actually met, so it's just been a joy to meet you in Blanca and feel the love and the energy. As he said, I did produce some episodes, over 100 one-hour documentaries of a public radio program called Afro Pop Worldwide, which was music and culture of Africa and the diaspora, starting in 1990. And I was able to use this as a probing tool to fill in my musical map of Africa. So I think I was unusually well prepared to understand the geographical complexity of the music in Africa and the music in this hemisphere, which has sort of been that kind of musical geography has been my passion over these years. I came to Gwen later than a lot of you. I was working on what became my first book. I've published 4, and in all of them, you know, Gwen has one way or another been present, and her work was really foundational to, especially to my first 2 books. I was working on the book that became Cuba and its music. My first book might have been around 2000 in Boat's library at NYU, and I discovered, you know, I'm a big fan of open shelves in libraries because the book you really need is the one you didn't know about that's next to the one that you thought you wanted. And I found the purple book, right? Africans in Colonial Louisiana. And this was right when I was trying to figure out, I had a pretty good sense of the African music of Cuba, but how did this, there wasn't a lot of information, you know, and back then. And there's a book called Africans in Colonial Louisiana, and I spent quite a lot of time studying it. And like I said, it became foundational to ideas that were both in Cuba's music and my next book. In particular, the work she did, I'm going to assume that most of you are generally familiar with the arc of all the work she did, and there's a time, and I'm perhaps not the best person to try to explain it all, but the information that she gave us in that book is so crucial to understanding, well, in my case, why is this incredibly rich music the way it is? And you know, imagine if all we knew about the Louisiana colony was that it was founded by white people from Europe, but we didn't know what countries, you know, right? But if we know that there were, like the French period, there were, I think it was 23 slave ships, 16 from Senegambia, first 6 from Ouida, 1 from and 1 from Congo, Angola. That is to say, the 3 major regions that were slaved for the slave trade, Upper Guinea, Lower Guinea, and Central Africa, but in very uneven proportions so that the Senegambians dominated. Well, this tells you a lot about what you might expect about what the music of Louisiana was like during the French period, and I admit that ever since then I have been meditating on the implications of this. Obviously, after that, the picture becomes much more complicated as New Orleans being the crossroads that it was. But this was really important to formulating some of the ideas. I later, of course, realized, I didn't even know this at the time, that the first populated, if you take what we might call these 3 major fountainheads of African American culture, Chesapeake, Charleston / Low Country, and the Gulf South, the major early populators of all 3 were from Senegambia, right? Which is not true in, say, Cuba, where, like, there's no banjo, right? Where very few Senegambians were brought. So this is really an important thing to know, right? My next book, The World That Made New Orleans, which to my shock and delight, people was taken very much to heart in New Orleans, and people are still reading it. It was very, very, I think I said as much in the acknowledgments, the book simply would not have been possible without the foundational work that Gwendolyn had done. Well, while I was working on that book, I lived in New Orleans for a year. I live in New York City, but I lived in New Orleans as a Tulane Rockefeller Humanities Fellow in 2004 or 5, the year before the flood, right? And came back in August, 3 weeks before Katrina, to speak at Satchmo Summerfest. And I thought that was when I visited Gwen for the first time. We had been corresponding, and we kept up a correspondence from then on through the end of her life. But I actually went to visit her at her house, which there was this frightening large dog in this enormous cage. And then from the house, we're sitting on the patio, and this elegant woman comes out with a glass of red wine in her hand and said, "Would you like a glass of wine?" And Glenn said, "This is Mabel." And I've just been handed a glass of wine by Mabel Williams, right? I don't know who Mabel Williams is, right? I just met Mabel Williams. And with this sort of sweet grandmotherly expression, Gwen says, "We go back a long way in the armed self-defense movement." And as I got to talk to you, I interviewed Gwen. We did a show. We did an Afro-Pop Worldwide Hip Deep hour, and you can find it on SoundCloud. I interviewed her and made a radio program talking about some of the ideas that we were developing. And in the course of this, there was talking to her. She told me immediately about her database. And I'm like, database? I didn't get it at first. I knew what databases were, but of course this was really before our lives had been so transformed by the idea that Google knows everything about you because they have these hundreds of data points on you. Well, this is a tool that historians use, and as you all know, Gwen was a pioneer of this. And so it was that, flashing forward, I think it was 2014, I visited her for 3 days in East Lansing at a slavery database conference. And by now, this has become mainstream what the historical profession is doing. And there's this whole world of scholars there, right, who are working on slavery databases and learning all kinds of things by correlating all these data points. And I learned a lot. I mostly was there to see Gwen, and I just kind of appointed myself her attendant, which, as you said, entailed running at top speed after her power chair across the campus much of the time. But there was another side to it too, which was that when everybody filed out for lunch, Gwen was still there by herself in the power chair in the room and had to get out of there, which meant going down to this narrow, stinky little alley in the food room, you know, or whatever. So it was the first time I'd gone around with a disabled person, and everyone should have that experience if they haven't. And during that conference, I was talking to one of the younger scholars there, a distinguished man, as we were walking across the campus, and I was talking to him about, you know, databases, and I said, it's been very important for me to understand the numbers, you know, and he said, it's not about the numbers anymore. He said, we know the numbers. He said, it's about who the people were, right? And that is something that Gwen understood from the very beginning. It's about who the people were, which is what sent her to go to every parish courthouse when no other scholars were doing this. People looking up family genealogies were, as she described to me, but scholars were not going through and systematically taking down this information, and now we have the Gwendolyn Midlo Hall here, where people come to take rubbings of the names of family members. It's such a beautiful thing to be here today and feel this power that has come from the work that she did. I will say there's one other involvement I had I think was worth mentioning, which was that I consulted with her in the early stages, not so much the later stages, I think she got a little mad at me, but in the early stages of her memoir. And I remember when I was in East Lansing, they kept saying, write the memoir, write the memoir. So many people, you know, go transition out, you know, to the next world without having, you know, left their testament. You've got to write the memoir. I'm sure I was not the only person who was doing this, and it was something she wanted to do. She sent me a draft, and she said, what do you think? And as she later said, he was scathing. And you know, somebody asked, you tell them, you know, so somebody really was, okay, I think it needs some work, and actually, when I read the finished book, she really answered my objections. I don't know if I had anything to do with it or not, but I very much felt part of the process. And what I said to her, one of the things I said to her was, she was very eager, of course, to tell about her accomplishments, as well she should be, but I said, it's not just about what you did, it's about what you saw. And I think, I'm going to guess that many of you have read the memoir with the perfect title, Haunted by Slavery. And one of the things that you get a sense of when you read it was all these worlds she moved through. This portrait that she draws, I mean, being born just before the Depression, right? Just before the stock market crash. This portrait of Jewish New Orleans. It's extremely valuable for historians. All of the places she went, the circles that she traveled in. I'm looking at a copy of it right here, and I just want to say that I am so happy that this book exists. And with that, I think I'll stop my remarks and hand the mic to someone else, but thank you for listening.
Okay, so let's see. We have Rachel Brulin, Bruce James. We're definitely running over, but it's worth every second, frankly. So this here.
Hi, I know some of you, but not everybody. My name is Rachel Brindlin, and I'm the director of the Neighborhood Story Project at the University of New Orleans, and a professor in the anthropology department. And just wanted to kind of talk for a second about coming into graduate school post-Creole New Orleans and post-Africans in colonial Louisiana. I was the generation that came after that as a scholar and an ethnographer. And it's such a blessing to have been able to come of age with that foundation that I took for granted in some ways. It's wonderful to hear the stories of the transformations of how the book intersected other scholars as well, because I think it really is a light post or a lighthouse of guiding a lot of us. The Midlo Center for New Orleans Studies, of course, is endowed by Haywood's grandparents, and I just wanted to acknowledge how seminal the Midlo Center was and the public history program was at UNO, and continues to be. Amali and Ryan have been wonderful colleagues to work with around the memorial for Gwen, and but the commitment to public scholarship at UNO has come from, the Midlo family, and also the inspiration that happened with Gwen. And soon after that, experience of doing graduate school, the university actually started the Neighborhood Story Project with me, which is a collaborative ethnography organization that helps people tell their own stories. And when I think about how reading Africans in colonial Louisiana impacted the way that I did ethnography, I'll just tell you one small story. I was based at a public high school called John McDonald Senior High for years, and my students were mostly from public housing in the city, and I was interested in having them learn their family histories. So I asked them to interview their grandparents and find out where they came from, and almost all of them came from the River Road parishes, and many of them spoke Creole, either grandparents or great-grandparents, because of these connections between the river and the city that sometimes we overlook. So I learned about Creole from my students at John Mack. Their students didn't know that much about it, except in the vernacular of using the words like bankhead or buku or whatever. But it stayed on my mind to want to know more about that language and the connections with the river. And when Bruce and I, Sampha Barnes and I began working together about 11 years ago, I was so happy to spend time with someone who spoke Creole, and we decided to do a language repatriation project of recording songs in Louisiana Creole and transcribing them. And we were very, very much inspired by Africans in Colonial Louisiana's chapter on San Malo, which is dedicated to the Maroons outside of New Orleans, and looking at how most likely that the language of the Maroon communities was Louisiana Creole. And so the whole beginning part of our book was Le Coeur Creole is dedicated to her scholarship and through art and language and music. And we've also created a traveling exhibit that's an altar dedicated to San Malo and freedom seekers everywhere. And I was just thinking about what you were saying about her early life and then this scholarship. I know most of us have these kind of metaphorical experiences while we are doing our research, right? There's some people that we're attracted to write about or to learn about because it speaks to something inside of ourselves, our own experiences. And I think sometimes when I read that chapter in Africans in Colonial Louisiana about San Malo and Cecilia, who was San Malo's inseparable companion, I think about your parents, and having to basically having to leave where they came from to be able to hold on to their love and their community, but also providing a safe harbor for so many people over the years through scholarship and commitment to social justice. And that metaphor has stayed with us in our traveling altar as we welcome freedom seekers from around the world and our continued dreams of freedom. So thank you so much.
Okay, so the last person that we want to hear from tonight, I would love to have a lot of other people come, but we're definitely short on time. Dr. Joyce Jackson, I'd like to have her come up and say a few words. I just met her in the last day or two, and we had a lot of great conversation.
Good evening. I would certainly like to thank Haywood for inviting me to speak. I'm Dr. Joyce Jackson, as he said, and I'm chair of the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University. And when Ibrahima Seck called me and told me that Gwen had passed, the first thing that came to mind was a great tree has fallen. In the Ghanaian tradition, you have, in the traditional Ghanaian tradition, shall I say, they don't refer to the person over the country as the president or the prime minister. They refer to them as the Santahini. The Santahini was the big chief. And that's what I thought about. I said, wow. And the people in the country say a great tree has fallen when he makes this transition. And that's just what I thought about Gwen, because you have this great tree, but you have all the roots, and you have all the branches that she has touched, and that will still live on after she's gone. So her legacy is still here, and her spirit is still here. I first actually became familiar with her work when I was actually, I shared this with the group that was at the Midlo Center the other day. I first became familiar with her work when I read a chapter from her book that she had submitted with a grant that she was applying for the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. So I was on the review board, and I read it, and I thought, wow, I got to see the rest of this book. I got to read the rest of this book. I can't wait till it comes out. She had come there because she had to pay for all the graphs and the charts and things like that were in the book because the Louisiana press didn't pay for it. So after I read the book, I don't know, so I forgot how I contacted her, but she told me that she was going to be giving a paper at this conference in Mobile, Alabama. It was one of the historical conferences. And so I drove from Baton Rouge to Mobile just to hear her speak and to meet her. And so as I'm, after her presentation, I'm trying to talk to her, some more pointers about the book and talking about the book, and she turns to me, she said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a folklorist and ethnomusicologist. Oh, I know someone that I'm going to introduce you to. That person, she said, I know another ethnomusicologist who's a Senegalese, and that person was Ibrahima Seck. Ibrahim, of course, was working with the blues, and he had come into Louisiana and Mississippi to do the work with his dissertation. But he was really interested in the blues. He would go into the juke joints of Mississippi and hear the blues. He said it reminded him so much of home. He heard them playing on the guitar and some of the 1 or 2 string instruments, and he said, oh, it sounds like an ngoni from my homeland. And that kept him here. And Gwen, so that's just how she was. I'm trying to talk to her about her work, and she connects me with somebody else, that I wasn't really expecting that day. So that was just, a twofer for me. I was really getting to know her, and I was introduced to Ibrahim at the same time. Later on, a few years later, I was coordinating a conference at LSU, and I called her and asked if she would be one of the guest speakers, and she said yes. That was in 1999. I brought Gwen in as one of the speakers, and we spent 3 days together because it was a 2-day conference. And the 3rd day, I took all my speakers out on a tour of the River Road. And we went to Laura Plantation, Evergreen Plantation, and River Road African American Museum. They had not finished Whitney yet. And so I got to spend those days with her and get to know her much better. And she liked my husband's work. Jay Nash Porter, who was a documentary photographer, had done work in Senegal also. And she called us one day and she said, well, next time you come to New Orleans, come by my house and bring your images with you, some of the images from Senegal. So we did. And what you see on her slave database CD is my husband's image of a Senegalese woman. We were crossing the Gambia River, and it was about to start raining, and it was very windy, and that lady was just so impressive, standing up there with the wind blowing through her scarf, and he took that picture, and that's the one that Gwen selected to go on her slave database. So I've known her through the years. We've talked about different things, and I'll just, since we have had so many speakers, I'll just end with the fact that, well, it's an old saying, an old African saying that in order to remember a person and keep their legacy and their spirit alive, you continue to call their name. We've called her name quite a bit the last few days, but I decided, in talking with Haywood, that we're going to name a symposium, the Gwendolyn Midlo Hall Symposium, and we're going to have it in LSU about a year from now in February, a couple of days before Mardi Gras. So I'm inviting all of you now to come back and join us for the Gwendolyn Midlo Hall Symposium. And with that, a great tree has fallen. Thank you.
Well, it looks like I'll be back.
The last speaker.
We have another speaker.
Can I do a point? The list is over?
Yeah.
Okay. So before you conclude, I would like to just say one word.
Okay. Do you want to do that?
Yeah. Excuse me. Before the conclusion of Haywood, I would like also to acknowledge some people like Michel Brière, who is our a board member of the Whitney Institute, former board member, or still board member, okay. Ellen Grunwald of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, was a good friend too. And of course, Douglas Chambers. He has a lot to say about Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. At one time, you lived in her house over there in Harrisburg, where she joined you, a wonderful team. And this is a historian of slavery. And if you want to know about the Bite of Biafra, about the Igbo people, that's Douglas Chambers. He has also many articles about slavery and the slave trade to Louisiana. And last, I would like to also acknowledge Mali Mitchell, the director of the Midlo Center for New Orleans, New Orleans Studies, that's it. And Sunday they had a nice ceremony at the Midlo Center with Kathe Hambrick. They built an altar for Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, and I saw you play. I was not there, I missed it, and I saw Dr. Michael White, Senpai, and many other people. And also, I would like to acknowledge our executive director. That's my boss right there. Raise your hand. She's all the way there, you know. She's so shy. This is Ashley Rogers. We spend many hours on Zoom with Haywood to put together this ceremony here, and I think we have to now acknowledge everybody and also all the staff of the Whitney Plantation that is here today to help us turn this into a success. Thank you very much.
Yes, I have to second that. I mean, this is kind of a major production, and the timing was awkward because of holidays and all of those things. There was a lot of effort, and I think that it's going well. So I really appreciate it. So I'd like to go on with the last part, which is I start really talking a little bit about the altar in the Midlo Center. This is what happened a couple days ago, you know, I mean, it was a very moving event for me. I think that I feel very, you know, connected to New Orleans in a way that of course, it made sense that I should have that connection, but it's taken me a long time. but that's, you know, things change and things move along, and so this has been a big growth for me. Okay, so if we can go, well, I want to say this altar here, you know, it's sort of a hybrid between a Mexican altar and African altar. No, the next one. So Day of the Dead is a very big thing in Mexico. I mean, it's so big, it's hard to imagine until you go there sometime and see it. And you know, you can't take a superficial look at it. Day of the Dead in the past, this altar was like from the year before, and here you can see some of Mom's relatives at the top there, and literally every one of those people were killed by Nazis, except for one. These were cousins and relatives. You know, there's my Uncle Jaime there. You know, there's Razel there, my aunt. There's my father, of course. There's my grandparents. There's this person, Jim Holland, who was my surrogate father and helped me get through the transition from being a teenager to an adult. That wasn't an easy transition. And in the middle is one of my mom's sisters who died either of rabies or rabies vaccine. That was never very clear. But in any case, so this altar that you see on the right is the altar that was at our office that was put together. It was orchestrated by Blanca, I'm sure. Let's see, the next. Okay, again, that's the same altar. And then just a close-up at the top is Mom, my father, and Blanca's father. You know, so, and these are beautiful things, really. The next one is, you know, pretty much the day after Mom's death, and this was the dog that's been mentioned a couple times. You know, this was where she's been for the most part for the last 10 years easily, and has been did a lot of really productive work. You know? The next is, well, this was at the event that Pierre mentioned, Pierre, I'm sorry. So this is my sister and my mom, and so and unfortunately Rebecca couldn't be here today. And the next one, I mean, these are our family members. You know, this is they're, you know, Blanca and my boys. They're 18, 19 now. This is over there is Rebecca, Bea, and Caleb. And then the picture at the bottom there is my brother Leo, who you know, has been a major figure in our lives, and there's been a lot of tragedy around that. I mean, he was, I think, the biggest victim in many ways. He was separated from my mother at the age of 5 because of politics and race, and you know, that's a pretty big blow for any child, and it's a big blow for our mother too, you know, and so it was a constant thing in our lives. And I want to show you the next slide, a video, and this is a work that my sister's done, and you know, we talk about legacy. It's worthwhile seeing some of the things that are, well, one of the things that she's done. I think it's interesting. You'll like it.
I'm a historian, a granddaughter of slaves, and I'm haunted. For hundreds of years, our ancestors were brutally silenced. I wasn't supposed to find their voices. Sometimes when you're hinting at the past is not to me. Women wears liver rolls and slave ships, and conquered enslavers leading miracles. In the name of race for history, great uncovers this history. I was born to tell the story. I had no idea that uncovering their stories would be its own fight. Wake is a powerful reminder that while the past is gone, we still live in its wake.
So that's a powerful publication. It's worth getting and looking into, I would say. And it's clearly, you can see the line between my mom and the work that she's done. The next picture. So I just want to give you an idea of where we live in Mexico. This is Guanajuato. I've had some of you visited. This is where Mom has spent a good part of the last part of her life. You know? So next picture. It's a great place. It's been a good place for us in many ways. It's the place where I was raised as a child, so I always kind of felt comfortable with a certain amount of safety there. You know, all of the turmoil and stuff that we see in the United States, when you come in from the outside as a child, it's like, wow, this is crazy. But so next slide. Yeah, so you know, we did basically everything we could to make her life, you know, comfortable and make it so that she could continue to be productive. Like I said, she had some major close calls and always managed to pull out another book. So it's like, we got to keep working on this, you know. I've had some interesting conversations with people about blacks in Mexico, and I thought I'd take this opportunity just to bring that up a little bit, because people don't really know. Next slide. There's 2.5 million Afro-Mexicans, and you know, they're now officially, you know, recognized. Of course, they've been there for quite a while. There's been a strong influence of Afro-Mexicans in Mexican culture. you know, these colossal heads, these are the earliest they're called Olmec heads. These are the earliest archaeological items in Mesoamerica. I mean, so we're talking about like the first things. And there's a controversy about where they came from and whatnot. There's 15 or 20 of them, and they're like the size of a small building. And you can, you know, I don't know exactly. There's been, you know, there's been some discussion in academics about where this is and where it's not and whatever. But those are clearly African-looking heads, you know. So you have to be struck by that. Next slide. So, you know, there are, these are folks, they're mostly in Oaxaca and Guerrero, and also in, well, generally the southern part of Mexico. And I've stumbled into them, and they, you know, they're really, it's an interesting culture that's there. The next slide. So, one of the founding fathers of Mexico, Jose Maria Morelos, was an Afro-Mexican. There were like 4 revolutionaries, and he was one of them. You always see him with a bandana on, but I caught one image of him without it, and so he was typically hiding his hair. This one on the lower left is Vicente Guerrero. He was the 2nd president of Mexico, and he was an Afro-Mexican and freed the slaves in Mexico. And then on the right down there is Jasper Yanga, who in the year 1575 basically fomented a rebellion against the Spaniards. And this is like, he formed literally the first independent colony of independent municipality from Europe. This was 1575. This was long before even the Haitian Revolution. And if you go to this place, there's a big statue of Yanga in the middle of the town square. You know, so it's just, these are interesting things, and I think, you know, I've gotten interested in these things partially because of my mom's interest in history, and it's the next. I just wanted to say, so, you know, Mom has always been very supportive of me. I'm not a historian, you know, but she's always been there to help me with my career, and she's been, you know, she's guided me in all kinds of active and passive ways. This is one of our conferences. And I'd have to say that, you know, I mean, obviously my mom and Blanca have been a major part of my life and of the things that we've been able to get done. Next slide. You know, she's taken a real interest in the work that I've done. This is with some midwives in Chiapas. Well, the midwives are all over, but so these are some of the midwives that were trained. And we've trained over 40,000 people altogether. So we've had a major impact in Mexico. And, you know, I think I'm saying all of these things because there's things that I've learned or I've gotten from my mom, right? I mean, it's basically, you know, you have to take the knowledge you have to connect it to other people who can make things happen. You have to have a social commitment, you know, and you know, I've learned to do that, I think, from my mom. You know, that's where those things come from. I had to do my medical version of it. I'm going to say into this is very, my first contact with my grandson, the next was this. Next slide. Yeah. So this was 5 weeks ago. My grandson came in pretty much, you know, crashing and burning, and we've taught all these emergency obstetrics things, and he really had a rough time. And so, I mean, this was the intensive care unit. So we were scared, and it's been, you know, it's a terrifying thing to go through. Okay. The next picture. But he's like, seems to be recovering pretty quickly, you know, he's starting to look like a normal kid. And, you know, next, I'm sorry. Yeah, and so this this is just last week. He's like a month old, and he's, you know, he seems to have an attitude and seems to have, you know, so, you know, I think we can expect a lot of good things from here. And I wish that Mom had been here to see him, obviously, you know, missed him by a couple months. His name's Kenny, and he's a miracle because, you know, I'm a scientist. I'm not supposed to believe in miracles, but that's a miracle. If we can just do this last video. I have to just show this. I love this video, so it's about the legacy of my mom here. You know, it's an amazing little bit of video. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So, you know, Mom was amazing, unstoppable, just, I mean, full blast. You know, one of the things that she told me was that, you know, the best was yet to come for me. You know, it all starts around the age of 60. But you can't talk to Mom about retirement, right? I mean, I never learned what retirement was. If you're retiring, you pick the wrong thing to do, apparently. And you know, that was, I think, a major lesson for me that I've gotten from her. And, you know, she literally, all of the stuff, not all of it, but, you know, most of what you're seeing is her after her, quote, retirement. And, you know, what I see is that there's somebody who has incredible skills and incredible knowledge. And then when they're retired, they're unshackled from all the institutional stuff. And that's really the time when you can be most productive. And that's a really, to me, that's a really bright thing. You know, I never understood the retirement thing, and I think I know why, because my parents were like this, you know. But the next picture. So these are pictures of my mom. I mean, she was really, I have to say, a beautiful person, you know. And so next picture. I understand that Tulane is going to name a building after her. That's great. There's some process going on, some negotiation. I don't know exactly what the deal is, but I'm sure they'll work it out. I swear I saw a picture of Margaret Mead that looked like this somewhere. I'm not sure. I think that's her Margaret Mead picture. And then the last one is, again, you know, she was always cheerful. She really, you know, I mean, honestly, it's not like she hadn't suffered. I mean, she really had to go through hell. And she was positive and brought her 2 black kids along and, you know, fought the world. And she didn't flinch, didn't bat an eyelash when she knew that something was right. And it didn't matter what the odds were, you know, and so I appreciate that very much about my mom, and I'm just glad that we all had her for the time we did. Thanks a lot. Thank you for coming.
Merci. All right, now we're going to start the procession to the Gwendolyn Midlo Hall for the ashes. Just follow the drums. And we have toilets to the left and to the right. Make sure to be comfortable before you get out there. And when you leave the museum, we have also toilets at the Welcoming Center. Thank you so much for all of you who came today to attend this event. Thank you. Yeah.
So tonight, if anybody's interested, I think we're going to meet at BMC, which is across from the New Orleans Jazz Museum. So that's between like 7 and 8. I think that's our idea. So anyway, just to tell you.
Okay.
Do what? I don't know. Where? Oh, here? Oh, well, that's possible. I wasn't following. Yeah, that's right. I think it's the second line. No, the other two down. I'm the funeral. He's doing good. Yeah, we just lost our brother.